What's up, nerds? Western sanctions appear to actually be working on Russia. It's just not in ways that you might have been thinking. So we're going to talk about this Reuters article that's talking about how U.S. sanctions are hampering Russian efforts to repair oil refineries. It's an interesting read, and we're actually going to do something a little bit different. Normally what I've done on this channel is I have basically summarized in my own words what the article is talking about and then reacted. And so what we're about to do is I'm just going to read this article with you and then react as we go. And then I'm going to have a link to this article in the video description for you to read along or read on your own if you want to. It's a really interesting article written by Robert Harvey. It was published earlier this morning, 5:55 a.m. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about kind of what it means. So diving right in here, we got the first paragraph. When engineers at Russian oil firm Lukoil discovered a turbine had broken at their largest oil refinery on January 4th, they quickly realized the problem was far from trivial. There was only one company that knew how to repair the gasoline-producing unit at the North Sea refinery, located on the Volga River, some 430 kilometers east of Moscow. The problem was that the company is American, according to 5 familiar sources with the incident. Not good. Not off to a good start here. The firm, Petroleum Engineering Multinational UOP, we got it. Boy, let's work on that name. Had withdrawn from Russia after the country invaded Ukraine in February 2022. They, meaning the engineers, rushed around to find spare parts, and they couldn't find anything, said a source close to Lukoil, who asked not to be named because he was not allowed to speak to the media. Then the whole unit just stopped. And I think that this is kind of like an interesting example here at the start, because this is just a random accident, it appears. It's not related to the war in Ukraine. Like, you know, large machinery, it needs repairs just generally, like, because that crap, like, it breaks down. It can be very expensive to maintain. And here we have like just a benign incident, not necessarily related. I mean, related to the war in Ukraine, just because they're not able to get, you know, access to either, you know, repair expertise or the repair parts themselves. But you know, the breaking of the part wasn't necessarily because of a Ukrainian drone strike, but we'll get to that here in just a moment. 4 other sources said the unit, a catalytic cracker used to convert heavier hydrocarbons into gasoline, has been out of production since January, and it was not clear when it could be repaired due to the lack of expertise inside Russia. The KK-1 unit is only one of 2 catalytic crackers at the plant. So that's not good. There's not a lot of redundancy, it would seem here. I mean, look, I'm not an expert in oil refining or oil refineries. Obviously, I think anybody, you don't even need to be a logistician to know that, yeah, you're going to need repair parts. You're going to need a pretty steady access to repair parts and that, you know, the kinds of mechanics that can do that easily. And this is kind of like an impact that Russia is having to deal with outsourcing that expertise to a foreign company. As a result, the North Sea refinery, the 4th biggest in Russia, has cut gasoline production by 40%, according to 2 sources. Lukoil did not respond to requests for comment for the story. The Lukoil refinery is an example of wider problems in Russia's energy sector, where some oil firms are struggling in the face of Western sanctions to repair their refineries, built with the help of the US and European energy firms, according to at least 10 Russian industry sources. You know, that's not a good position to be in, especially if, you know, the sanctions that are hitting the Russian economy right now are from US and European firms and governments. That's going to really impact their ability to procure the parts that they need. And I've been talking about this in past videos, and at the very least, definitely down in the video comments when talking with some of you guys about, you know, the impact of sanctions. I'm glad that we have the, you know, and that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this article, because it gives us an opportunity to really look at it and really see kind of what I've been talking about with how really these attacks on, you know, Russian oil refineries, but also Western sanctions, it's not a game ender for the Russian economy. Like, it's still grown since the war began, but it's definitely going to make it more difficult for them to procure more specialized parts and expertise, like, for instance, when we're talking about their energy sector. The difficulties have been exacerbated by Ukraine's drone attacks that have struck at least a dozen Russian refineries this year, the industry sources said. The attacks forced Russian refineries to shut in some 14% of capacity in the first quarter, according to Reuters calculations. Now, that is a pretty significant chunk of refinery capacity just for one quarter. This has become a point of contention. We talked about this in a past video. I think it was like last week, talking about how U.S. decision makers in the White House were not thrilled with Ukraine targeting the Russian energy sector. And those concerns were coming from more the political concern that it would lead to higher gas prices here in the United States, and that could cause election issues for President Biden, during this election season. That, of course, and this article is going to talk about it, so a bit of a spoiler here, that is also a political concern within Russia, meaning, the gas prices at the pump for your average consumer, that's a big concern for the Kremlin. And Ukraine, they're targeting these facilities, at least they say they're targeting these facilities with Ukrainian-made drones and Ukrainian-made systems. And, and I say that because if it was U.S. provided, then the U.S. can have a say in how it's used. At least that's how the policy kind of works with these weapon systems. Same goes for many European systems. But here in this case, it's Ukrainian-developed systems or Ukrainian-owned systems, and they're firing them into Russia. No one can really tell Ukraine to stop. That's just kind of, they're in a war right now. Any rational person that's at a war would target pretty much anything to slow down your adversary. And this is a pretty, significant way that Ukraine can do so. And they've been effective with it so far. And we're seeing how effective they are right now. If this stream of drones continues at this rate and Russian air defenses don't improve, Ukraine will be able to cut Russian refining runs quicker than Russian firms will be able to repair them, said Sergei Vakulenko, an expert on Russia's energy industry and non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and International Affairs think tank. And that's kind of what I've been saying. Look, it's not like Russia is completely devoid of the expertise or the, industrial capacity to repair these refineries, ultimately. However, it's just going to take them a little bit longer than it took them before. And if Ukraine can strike these refineries faster than Russia can repair them, then ultimately, that slowdown in production will snowball, and it will ultimately impact either Russian consumers or the Russian military. And either one of those can be a problem for the Kremlin. So this isn't necessarily a game of, Ukraine's going to ultimately, if they keep this up, they're going to shut down all Russian oil refinery capacity. No, they're just trying to continue this rate. It's a war of attrition, right? Continue to pop these facilities faster than Russia can repair them, and hopefully that gap, that divide in where, Russia is short on its ability to refine oil, that impacts, either the political base in Russia, the civilians, or that impacts the military. Russia's top energy official, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, said last week that the damaged North Sea facilities should resume operations within a month or two, as Russian firms were working to produce spare parts needed. He also said that Russian refineries have boosted production after the drone attacks, and there was no shortage on the local fuel market. Russia's energy ministry did not respond to a request for comment. Minister Nikolai Shulginov said on Wednesday all refineries should be fixed by June without providing further details. So here we get a couple of estimates. The deputy prime minister for Russian energy is saying that it should be done in a month or two. We're at the beginning of April pretty much, so that puts it at sometime in May or June. We've got another minister saying that it should be in June. So that's a couple, let's say 1 to 2 months lead time that Ukraine has right now on these facilities. Again, continuing to pop these facilities with drone attacks and other kinds of sabotage efforts, and that's going to continue to cascade and snowball. You're forcing Russia to, instead of producing parts for military equipment, instead of producing ammunition, you're forcing them to produce, or even producing things for the civilian economy. It's not like that's stopped. Instead, you're forcing them to produce parts for oil refineries, things that they didn't have to produce necessarily before because that was coming in from Western companies. So it's, you're kind of forcing them into a dilemma where they're having to make large economic decisions that will impact other areas of the economy or of the military. Again, not in a significant way necessarily, but if you keep this up, if you let the snowball, then it could become a significant problem. The fact that it's, we're talking about this here and that it's a 14% drop in production capacity, that's pretty significant. So you're already seeing some dividends paying off here for Ukraine, that is. The North Sea refinery near the city of Nizhny Novgorod has a capacity of 405,000 metric tons a month of gasoline, or 11% of Russia's total. The current outage would cost Lukoil nearly $100 million in lost revenues a month, based on an average Russian gasoline price of $587 per metric ton, according to Reuters calculations. Again, that's a lot of money. And every dollar counts in a war. And you're not only forcing them to make industrial decisions, manufacturing decisions, you're costing them money. That impacts their ability to procure weapons, pay salaries, stuff like that. And again, their economy is huge. It's not like they're going to go bankrupt tomorrow. So let's slow our horses. I'm just saying, again, over time, this is a war of attrition. That's how that kind of manifests itself. Honeywell International Incorporated, the parent company for UOP, said in a statement to Reuters that it had not provided any equipment, parts, products, or services to the refinery at Nizhny Novgorod since February 2022, nor to the independently managed Slavyansk ECO refinery. The Slavyansk refinery was hit by a Ukrainian drone attack on March 18th and caught fire briefly. Quote, "We are actively working to identify and interrupt any possible diversion of our products into Russia via third parties," Honeywell told Reuters by email. The company said it complies with all applicable export license requirements, sanctions laws, and regulations. Now that's interesting because we've seen before that the Russian military might be getting access to Starlink using third-party access and criminal and clandestine means to be able to get Wi-Fi to its troops on the front line in Ukraine. This might be another thing that they're trying to do. They're trying to use third parties and clandestine and criminal efforts to gain the spare parts from other countries that Honeywell and or UOP rather is working with. And that's going to be something that, not only the US and Western governments will have to look at and look into, not only with law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies, but also with, the use of secondary sanctions. We've seen that, kind of close some loopholes in the sanctions package, basically, where Russia might work with a third bank, maybe it's in Turkey or China. Secondary sanction would come in and target that bank, that second bank, wherever it is, and that forces that bank to sever that relationship. So that's kind of, it becomes a game of whack-a-mole, but again, there's only so many moles that you need to hit before things really start to make an impact. The United States and its allies have imposed sanctions on thousands of Russian targets since the invasion of Ukraine, and around 1,000 companies have announced their departure from the country. Russia's export-focused $2.2 trillion economy has proved more resilient to 2 years of the unprecedented sanctions than either Moscow or the West anticipated. Certainly true. I mean, we've seen the Russian economy grow, and I think, like I said before, sanctions, I think, are more of a tool to apply pressure, and they're not necessarily a tool to destroy an economy. I think a lot of people expected Western sanctions to turn Russia into North Korea overnight, but it took really decades to turn North Korea into North Korea and Cuba into Cuba pretty much. And that, for Russia, it might take that much longer too. You're having to, it's a time-based system. It's not something that is going to work overnight. It's not going to work in a couple years. It's going to work over 10, 15, 20 years, where technology continues to progress, economies continue to grow, but they have a harder and harder time procuring more expensive and more advanced technology because of sanctions. They're having to rely on more, criminal or clandestine means to procure those kinds of things. And you see how North Korea, for them to progress, they're either, having to go through clandestine methods, through criminal methods, or, working with China. And even then, they're still way behind, where the modern world is. Western companies such as UOP and Swiss engineering group ABB have supplied technology and software to all the 40 biggest refineries in Russia over the last 2 decades, according to more than 10 Russian industry sources. Each refinery has a combination of Russian and foreign equipment. ABB confirmed to Reuters it stopped taking new orders in Russia once the war broke out in February 2022 and has no plans to return to Russia once it has fulfilled its existing contractual obligations, the spokesperson said. The company did not provide details on those obligations. I find this very interesting. We don't know what those obligations are. Obviously, companies, they have to, you make an agreement, you have to stick with it. But at the same time, how do sanctions kind of play into that? That's something that I don't quite know. I think that's very interesting that's kind of going on there. And I'd be interested to see how much of that does kind of play into assisting with Russia kind of recover some of their refining capacity, if it is part of their, previous agreement or not. None of the 5 sources suggested the turbine failure in January at Nordsee was the result of drone attacks, but the sources said the problem at the plant only became worse after Nordsee was hit for the first time by Ukrainian drones in February when other pieces of equipment were damaged, putting additional strain on the entire refinery. As in the United States, the price of gasoline is a politically sensitive subject in Russia, and the authorities try to limit price rises. Recent measures included imposing a ban on gasoline exports for 6 months in February. And they're going to have, I mean, I don't know if they're necessarily going to have to, but I mean, maybe they will have to continue that export ban well into the future past those initial 6 months. That expires in July. We talked about those plants that should be repaired by June. You know, if Ukraine continues to attack these refineries, maybe they attack the plant that's producing these repair parts. That could force Russia to extend that export ban well into the future, for additional months. And again, that's lost revenues for the Russian government. Energy exports was one of the biggest sectors in the Russian economy pre-war. It still is a significant chunk of their economy, but again, if they're banning exports of oil, that's a significant impact, and that's not something to kind of blink at or whatever. But in a way, Ukraine says it attacks Russian refineries because it wants to undermine the Kremlin's war machine by reducing state revenues and cutting fuel to the army. Quote, drones are tens, if not hundreds of times cheaper than the cost of repairs, which is important in a war of attrition, says Vakulenko, who was a former head of strategy at Russian energy major Gazprom Neft. He left the firm in Russia days after the start of the Ukraine war. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter. It has rerouted most of its crude and products exports to Asia and Africa since Western nations imposed sanctions on Moscow. And that's another way that these sanctions can kind of come in and make an impact. I mean, it's not only make it more difficult for the Russian government and the Russian industry to repair these facilities, it's cutting who they can sell the energy to abroad and who they can have financial relationships to. It's a pretty broad package, a pretty large sanctions package, but again, it's just going to take time. They've got a pretty big war chest. They've got a pretty robust and resilient economy. It's really just going to be a test of how resilient and how long, can the West keep these sanctions in place. That's kind of where the real game gets put in. Should Moscow face a steep decline in refinery output, it would be forced to cut fuel exports in favor of crude, according to more than 10 Russian oil traders. And we just talked about that. Russia supplies crude to just a few large buyers such as China, India, and Turkey, but its portfolio of fuels buyers is comparatively broader as it can ship to smaller consumers without large refining systems in Africa and South America. Russia's refining industry dates back to the 1940s when the U.S. provided equipment under the Lend-Lease program during World War II. I'll tell you what, that topic has been popping off a lot on Twitter lately, talking about kind of the Russian idea that they bore the brunt of the German military in World War II. And now, of course, there's a bunch of memes talking about how much the U.S. supported Russia during World War II and that their military might have collapsed during World War II. Listen, we don't need to get into that here. Of course, the equipment certainly helps, but you need the soldiers to fight. It's probably a little bit of both here, both Russian resilience or Soviet resilience during World War II, but also the United States industrial capacity kind of bailing them out in a lot of ways. But, again, we don't need to talk about that. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian oil firms invested tens of billions of dollars in upgrades with the help of firms such as UOP and ABB. UOP helped upgrade North Sea and Slavyansky CO refineries. It did not specify which other refineries it had serviced in response to Reuters questions. I think that's kind of interesting because, again, at the time, it's upgrading these facilities and, that's a good thing for the Russians. But at the same time, like now with, the sanctions in place, a lot of those upgraded parts, they're coming from American companies and they require American expertise. And where is that in Russia? Not that they don't have it, but they probably don't have it necessarily in the quantity that they wish that they had right now. So it kind of ends up being a double-edged sword. The United States has imposed sanctions on companies around the world, including in Turkey, to prevent the transfer of technology to Russia. I think that's, we've talked just a little bit about secondary sanctions. That's kind of where we see that start to come in as well. Countries under Western sanctions, such as Russia and Iran, have long managed to find loopholes to obtain spare parts for Western-made equipment, such as planes or cars. And that's true. I mean, that's absolutely true. We've talked a little bit about that with Starlink and potentially here with repair parts. But again, you're forcing them to find those loopholes and work through those loopholes. Oftentimes, they can be a bit more time-consuming process-wise, or they can be more expensive. And that's kind of where those decades kind of come in of just that kind of cost and time investment compounding on itself. Ultimately, inevitably, it forces some kind of an impact. But refining equipment is much rarer and more specialized. Western firms have tightened checks to prevent Russia from importing spare parts via third countries. one of the 5 sources said. 2 of the sources said Lukoil had asked Chinese companies to repair the KK-1 unit at North Sea. The sources didn't name the Chinese companies. Lukoil declined to comment when asked if it had approached China. Quote, China has got the technology, but very often it would mean a full costly replacement of the unit rather than a normal, cheap, regular repair, said one of the sources. That's the end of the article. I think that's kind of an interesting way to place it because, yeah, of course, they can't just turn to their ally in China. China has, of course, as they say, the technology and the expertise to do that. But it's, I think of this analogy, right? A part of your car engine breaks and you have to get it repaired, right? And let's say you own some Ford and Ford has stopped making those parts a long time ago. So you can get the part, but it's going to take a lot of time for it to get shipped to the shop. It's going to be very expensive. The mechanic may not necessarily know how to put the part into the car. And so your car is going to be in the shop for let's say a month, and that's crazy. But the cost is not going to be as severe as if, say, you overhaul the entire engine. You rip out the Ford engine, and let's say you put in a Toyota engine. I don't know if that's even possible, but just humor me for the sake of this analogy. If you put in a Toyota engine, it's going to be way more expensive to do that because you're buying a whole new engine. You may as well buy another car. But at the same time, that Toyota engine is going to, let's say all the parts are still being produced by Toyota. It's way easier for you to get those spare parts. The maintenance trail behind it is extensive and broad, and there's plenty of expertise to get it done. So it's like if a similar part broke in the Toyota engine, they could swap it out in a matter of hours and you could be gone. The cost of swapping that engine is going to be incredibly immense, way more than just leaving the car in the shop for a month and getting it repaired that way. But at the same time, should another part break down, you're in a much better shape. So you're kind of absorbing that cost, which is going to be huge, way earlier in favor of just a lower cost, but also a larger time investment and just waiting on the repair to happen. I feel like that's kind of what's going on here with these oil plants, where they could just pay to have China completely, revamp these oil facilities, these refineries with Chinese parts, Chinese expertise, and Chinese technology. And then if anything happens, they can just turn to China for repair parts. And it'll be way easier for them to kind of get around the sanctions and, potentially get around the sanctions. Because again, the U.S. could just do the same thing with China that they were doing with Turkey and put sanctions on those companies. But certainly it would be easier for Russia to skirt those sanctions alongside China than it would so for an American company. And so I think that's kind of the dilemma that Russia finds itself. Does it keep the old Ford engine and just leave the car in the shop for a long time, potentially have that car get targeted by the Ukrainians, but the cost is going to be lower? Or does it swap it out with a Toyota engine, and that way, even if the Ukrainians target it, they can just swap that part out much quicker and much easier. So, and that's kind of, again, that's an impact that the sanctions are having. It's not necessarily an overnight thing. It's not, collapsing their economy. It's forcing them to make difficult economic decisions that over time will compound and kind of create effects on the Russian economy, on the political establishment, on the military, and that's kind of what they're designed to do. They're not designed for an overnight collapse of the Russian economy. So that, bit of a longer video. I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. It's an interesting topic. Again, I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert in, energy or anything like that, but I found this to be very interesting because it does relate exactly to kind of what we talk about a lot in this channel. So comment your thoughts on what you think here. Leave a like if you found this video interesting, and that also really helps the channel. I really appreciate it. And subscribe for more analysis on, not only the war in Ukraine, but also international affairs and defense and conflict. So with all that, I'll see you all later. Bye.